The full moon shone brightly in the night sky, causing the dark forest to come alive with all manner of twisting, winding shadows. A cold wind blew through the trees, filling it with the sound of rustling leaves. The conduit was walking through the forest, small twigs and dead leaves crunching beneath their feet, pain still surging throughout their body. They glanced about, trying to figure out which direction they were heading. There was no doubt about it. They were lost. They had been walking through the forest for hours at this point, with no sign of their destination, or much of anything for that matter. They were completely exhausted, and the chilling wind and various sounds of the forest did nothing to soothe their worries, the worries of their mind, or the wounds of their body. Their trek came to a brief halt when a noise caught their attention. It sounded like rustling, but not the constant rustling caused by the howling winds. No. This rustling sounded slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was slowly moving through the undergrowth of the forest. The conduit glanced toward the direction of the noise, but as soon as they did, the noise ceased. The conduit shrugged, returned their gaze in front of them, and continued walking. A few minutes later, they once again came to a stop. There it was again, the slow rustling. They glanced in its direction once again, but the noise came to a sudden stop, just like before. They once again resumed their walk. But another few minutes later, the rustling came yet again, and left just as quickly when the conduit looked in its direction. A chill crept up their spine. Were they being followed? Slowly, they reached for their weapon, but stopped when they came to the realization that this noise could just be a wild animal, or a figment of their imagination, brought on by their fatigue from all they had been through, not but hours earlier. Spotting a fairly decent-sized rock nearby, the conduit decided to take a small break, and sat upon the rock as they sat upon the rock. As they sat there, they thought back to how they had ended up in this situation. A few days earlier, a messenger from the Aval organization informed them that an astral fissure had appeared in a village in the nation of Romania. As luck would have it, the conduit was offered a job as a bodyguard for a caravan of goods that was en route to the same village where the astral fissure was said to be located. Their luck would change, however. As they were traveling along a narrow mountain path, the caravan was suddenly attacked by a horde of lizard men. The abominations did not hesitate in slaughtering every member of the caravan. Fortunately, the conduit managed to defeat the vile creatures. To the conduit's shock, however, one of the lizard men, thought to be dead, sprang up and lunged at the conduit, causing the two of them to fall and tumble down the cliff. The next thing the conduit knew, they were lying near the base of the cliff, pain surging through their body. They had clearly been knocked unconscious by the fall, indicated by the orange hue of the sky above. Slowly, the conduit climbed to their feet, pain shooting all throughout their body. As they glanced about in order to gauge their surroundings, something caught their eye. It was the corpse of the lizard man that was the cause of their fall, bloody and broken. How exactly they ended up in better shape than their attacker they did not know, but they were thankful for the fact regardless. There was no time to dwell on such a thing, however. They needed to hurry and close the astral fissure before something catastrophic happened. But how would they get to the village now? The only one who knew the way was killed along with the rest of the caravan. They could try to climb back up the cliff, but even though their injuries weren't too severe, they were certainly in no condition to do such a thing. Their only other option was to head into the nearby forest and try and find another way to get to their destination. Since they did not exactly have too much time to think about it, off into the forest they went, taking one more look at the setting sun and the corpse of the lizard man lying near them. Their reminiscing was cut short by a sound that had become all too familiar to them. The slow, ominous rustling. Instead of being followed by silence, however, a new sound accompanied it. A low growl rang through the trees, causing the conduit to jump to their feet. Suddenly, a large shadow leapt out from the tree line, straight in the conduit's direction. But they just barely managed to jump out of the way, causing their attacker to land underneath the shadow of a nearby tree with a heavy thud. The shadows made it difficult to determine the identity of their attacker, but the conduit could tell it was definitely not human. Could it be? Had the lizard man that attacked them earlier that day somehow survived and followed them into the forest? They would not have to wait long for their answer, as their attacker stepped out from the shadows and into the light of the moon. This was no lizard man, but it was just as monstrous. It stood on two powerful, digitigrade legs. Gray fur covered its large, muscular frame. Its fingers and toes were tipped with sharp claws. Its jaws jutted outward, forming a canine-like snout. Its eyes glared at the conduit, its jagged teeth bared in a menacing snarl. During their travels, the conduit had heard tales of these creatures, but questioned their validity. But there it was. A genuine werewolf stood in front of them, ready to pounce upon its prey. The conduit clasped their hand on their weapon, ready to defend themselves. With a roar, the werewolf lunged at the conduit, but they quickly sidestepped its attack, their weapon now in hand. The beast turned and lashed out with one of its clawed hands, only for the conduit to block the attack and counter with a slash of their own. The beast roared in pain and lashed out with its other hand. The conduit readied themselves to parry the attack yet again, but as they assumed a defensive stance, a jolt of pain lanced at their body. Wincing, they just narrowly ducked underneath the werewolf's attack. They retaliated with a low slash to the creature's leg, earning another howl of pain. The beast leapt backward and landed a few feet away. It let out an angry growl and ready to lunge at the conduit again. The conduit stood back up, their weapon firmly gripped in their hands. They took an offensive stance, but not before experiencing another jolt of pain. They gritted their teeth, trying to fight it off. Just then, the beast lunged forward, but this time with a flurry of claw slashes. They quickly raised their weapon and blocked the first strike, and then the next, and the next, and then another and another, all the while doing their best to fight off the surges of pain, which seemed to get worse the longer the fight went on. They could not keep this up for much longer. They needed to somehow create a distraction in order to escape. But how? The beast went for yet another strike, but rather than block the attack, the conduit stepped to the side, leaving the werewolf open for an attack. With this opening, the conduit swung their weapon and delivered a heavy slash to the creature's to the side of the creature's face, leaving an open gash on its cheek. Blood oozed from the wound. The werewolf let out groans of agony as it sank to the ground and covered the wound with its clawed hand. This was it. This was their chance. The conduit turned and prepared to run, but felt something grab their leg suddenly. Suddenly, they were forcefully yanked to the ground. Glancing over, they saw that the werewolf had its hand tightly gripping their leg, its sharp claws sinking into their flesh. The beast stood up and lifted the conduit into the air with its massive arms. Then, it swung them downward, slamming them hard into the ground. The conduit uttered a cry of pain as they felt the wind get knocked out of them by the impact. Then, the werewolf hoisted them into the air once again and swung them around. But this time, the creature let go of them, sending them crashing into the ground several feet away. Then, without warning, the werewolf leapt into the air and came crashing down onto the conduit, pinning them under its bulky frame. It opened its jaws, revealing its menacing sharp teeth. Saliva dripped from its maw. Its eyes were filled with a mixture of hunger and malice. The conduit tried their hardest to free themselves from the monster's hold, but to no avail. No, this could not be. This could not be how their journey ended. They tried to think of something, anything they could do to escape. An idea then sparked in their mind. They gave a quick glance at at the wound on the creature's cheek they inflicted earlier, and then shifted their eyes to their weapon, which was lying nearby, but it was too far out of their immediate reach. What wasn't, however, was a fairly decent-sized sharp stick. They grabbed hold of the stick and quickly weaved their arm around the creature's own into a ready position. The werewolf raised its head and prepared to sink its teeth into its latest victim. Now! This was their chance. The conduit thrust the stick upward, just as the beast thrust its head downward. Their makeshift weapon found its mark, and it was jammed right into the werewolf's open wound. With all their might, they shoved the stick even deeper, causing a large amount of blood to spurt from the wound. Still, the conduit persisted, continuing to push the stick further into the wound, the beast letting out wails of agony all the while. The stick sank deeper still, until it pierced through the monster's cheek and into its open mouth. The beast staggered back, freeing the conduit from its hold. Taking this chance, the conduit climbed to their feet and grabbed their weapon. Then, they ran around to the creature's back and plunged their weapon into its flesh, earning even more agonized wails. They quickly pulled their weapon out, and with the remainder of their strength, made a beeline into the forest. Faster and faster they ran, pure adrenaline fueling their every step. Behind them, they could still hear the werewolf's pained cries, but they certainly weren't going to stop to check if it was pursuing them. They dodged and weaved through the trees and twisting shadows, never once losing their pace. Eventually, they could no longer hear the beast's cries. The only sounds present were the howling wind, accompanied by the rustling of the trees, their heavy breathing, and the rushing water of a nearby river. Their steps started to slow until they came to a complete stop near the river's edge. Their legs were shaking so much they might topple over. Their arms felt like they were about to fall off, and the rest of their body was completely sore. Still breathing heavily, they made their way to a tree and slumped down against it. Bloody and beaten, they sat against the tree for a long while, letting the sound of the river calm their mind. Slowly, they closed their eyes and drifted off to sleep. The conduit opened their eyes. They looked up at the sky, which shone a dark shade of blue. Off in the distance, a small orange light signified the rise of the sun. They tried to get up, but winced at the pain that lashed at their body. Also, despite their small slumber, they still felt fairly exhausted. They decided to return to their sleep, but stopped when a noise caught their attention. A noise that filled them with dread. Rustling, but not just any rustling. A slow, deliberate rustling, as if something was slowly moving through the undergrowth of the forest. No! It could not be! the werewolf stepped out of the forest, a look of pure anger in its eyes, its teeth bared in a menacing snarl. Also, it seemed that the wounds it had received the night before had nearly healed. The creature took a step toward the conduit, who pulled themselves in the opposite direction. The beast took a few more steps forward, the conduit responding in kind by backing away a bit more. Suddenly, the beast came to a stop and readied itself to leap at its prey. The conduit, in turn, stood up and readied to evade the incoming leap. However, no leap came. What came instead were the beast's cries of pain. Something strange was happening. Its claws receded. Its gray fur began to disappear, replaced with patches of normal skin. Its animal snout shrank. Its legs and feet returned to the shape of a regular human's. Its fur completely disappeared. Its massive frame began to shrink as its beastly groans of pain slowly reverted to those of a human female. The conduit looked on in awe. Finally, the woman had completely returned to her human form. She staggered forward a few steps before her naked body collapsed to the forest floor. Shaking off their daze, the conduit slowly approached the woman and studied her features. She had light skin and long, jet-black hair. Her figure could best be described as quite voluptuous, its beauty only offset by the blood and nearly healed wounds it had gained the previous night. Suddenly, the woman began to stir. Slowly, she began to climb to her feet. She raised her head, her brown eyes filled with sorrow. "Please," she began. "Please, forgive me." She finished climbing to her feet, her eyes staring into those of the conduit. The two stared at one another in silence for a few moments, the woman's eyes beginning to fill with tears. Then, without another word, she turned and ran back into the forest, shortly vanishing from sight. The sun had long since risen by the time the conduit managed to find a way out of the forest. They were relieved when the labyrinth of trees gave way to a dirt path in the middle of a lush, grassy plain. They hoped it would lead them to a place where they could get some much-needed medical attention, as well as get them back on track to their original destination. As they walked along the path, they thought about the black-haired woman. She seemed so sad and remorseful. According to the legends, when one changes into a werewolf, they lose all control of their actions.